Compared to the great medieval hosts which had done battle at Crécy a decade earlier, the armies facing off near Poitiers in late September 1356 were small, perhaps due to the effects of the plague and war exhaustion. Edward of Woodstock's previously retreating chevauché army was made up of just over 6,000 troops, 1,000 mainly spear-armed Gascon infantry, 3,000 English men-at-arms, including mounted knights and their squires, and just over 2,000 Anglo-Welsh longbowmen wielding their infamous ranged weapons. These troops were divided into 3 mixed divisions of 1,500 soldiers each on the left, right and in the centre, while about 1,000 remained in a rearguard reserve. Opposite him, the French king's magnificent army had 3,000 infantry and 8,000 mounted knights, but the majority were ordered to dismount due to Jean's fear of a second Crécy taking place. Only an elite contingent of several hundred remained on their steeds. The French cavalry and crossbowmen were on the right, commanded by Marshal Arnauld d'Audrième, while manning the left were some Franco-German cavalry and more missile units under Marshal Jean de Clermont. The majority of dismounted knights and peasant infantry were arrayed in 3 central lines of battle, one in front of the other. They were led, from front to back, by Charles Dauphin of France, Philippe, Duke of Orléans, and King Jean II himself, respectively. As the two armies faced off, a French cardinal rode to the Black Prince, begging him to listen, and was met with the frosty response, "Say it quickly then, this is no time for a sermon." The prelate argued for a peace for the sake of all the Christian lives which would be wasted should the battle break out. Despite his hostility, the prince was still anxious about fighting a pitched battle, and was willing to make significant concessions. Unfortunately, Jean II demanded unconditional surrender, and so battle became the only way out. As the French commanders Audrième and Clermont surveyed the English position, they saw an unusual amount of movement and believed the enemy to be retreating. It was in fact probably an intentional ruse. Not willing to let the enemy get away, Audrième charged with his cavalry towards Warwick's left, while Clermont reluctantly took the same action, heading towards Salisbury's right. The former's well-armoured knights and horses initially resisted English arrow fire and crashed into the English infantry, inflicting significant damage on the first line. However, when longbowmen advanced up the riverbank anchoring their left wing and began to loose volley after volley into Audrième's flank, the attack turned into a massacre. French knights were either felled by arrows, crushed by their own steeds, or routed, while the marshal himself was made a prisoner. On the other side of the field, Clermont's horsemen charged up the ridge towards Salisbury's division, but were funneled into a narrow open section in the hedge protecting the English line. There, the bunched-up cavalry suffered terrible losses before breaking through, and when they did, they were engaged by Salisbury's dismounted knights. After a fierce clash, the French were thrown back. The French infantry vanguard under the Dauphin followed behind in good order along the entire front. However, they too were forced to funnel themselves through the hedge's gaps, and many were killed by devastating arrow fire whilst doing so. Those who broke through met the Anglo-Gascon men-at-arms in vicious hand-to-hand fighting, which lasted 2 hours, but they were finally pushed back with heavy losses and nothing to show for it. As the Dauphin's forces had been defeated, King Jean II ordered that his son be escorted from the field in case of a disaster, but it turned out to be a disastrous move. The Dauphin's withdrawal convinced the Duke of Orléans, who led the second line of infantry, to leave the battlefield with the troops in that formation as well. Advancing with a battle-axe in hand, Jean II led the largest and final division, crossbowmen in front and infantry behind, up the ridge towards the English. With the Black Prince's archers running out of arrows, the French king's contingent closed with the English almost unscathed, with his most elite knights and the fresh 3rd Division outnumbering the nevertheless stubborn and high morale army of the prince. When the archers ran out of arrows, they left their positions and took up swords, knives and axes, joining their comrades in the melee. At the combat's fiercest moment, the Captal de Buch gathered 200 reserve cavalry and led them in a wide swinging arc around to the French rear. He raised the flag of St. George and then charged at Jean's rear ranks. Seeing this, the Black Prince withdrew some of his dismounted knights from the line, mounted them, and had an impetuous knight called Sir James Audley lead them to crash into the other French flank. The remnant of Jean's army scattered in every direction, a significant portion of them towards a marsh called the Champ d'Alexandre, where the English longbowmen slew many of them. In the chaos, the King of France was surrounded by enemy soldiers who demanded his surrender. He refused to give himself up to common soldiers, but then the Earl of Warwick rode through and formally took Jean prisoner. All in all, while the English suffered minimal losses, probably around 100 or two, the French had lost at least 2,500 dead, including Clermont and many other nobles. Around 3,000 were also taken prisoner, including the French king himself, who was led to the Black Prince with full medieval honor. When the Black Prince removed his Royal Valois prisoner from France, he also removed the anchor which kept the ship of state afloat. As military historian John Corrigan stated in his book A Great and Glorious Adventure, France was effectively in a state of civil war. The 3 years following Poitiers were some of the worst in French history. Rabid discontent with the government spread like a plague among the nobility, and Paris's Third Estate even asserted its authority under the Provost of the Merchants of Paris, Etienne Marcel. This wasn't the end of it. Demobilized soldiers, deserters and common bandits from England, Gascony, France and even further afield went renegade and formed so-called routiers, or free companies. These bands of armed men roamed and ravaged the lawless countryside almost at will, serving any who would pay them, and sometimes even setting themselves up as robber barons in their own right. They would remain a problem for decades to come. Even in lands where feudal control was maintained, it didn't do France any good. Extortionate ransom payments paid to the English for the swath of high-born prisoners taken at Poitiers prompted a ruthless tax hike, and this finally inflamed the peasants into a revolt. A horrific bloodletting, known as the Jacquerie, began in the Oise Valley, with peasants lynching and murdering any noble they could get their hands on. The uprising lasted for weeks, before Charles of Navarre brutally put it down. Threatened by another large assault by Edward III, the beleaguered Dauphin signed the Treaty of Bretigny in October 1360, giving the Plantagenets all of Aquitaine, Ponthieu and Calais in return for the English king's renunciation of his own claim to the French throne, in addition to a £600,000 ransom for Jean's return.